Andrew, we saw a lot of interest in Bitcoin, particularly after the bank crisis in March of last year. We had three of the largest US bank collapses in history. And you've recently highlighted that American banks are still very much at risk, especially for those that have more than the FDIC insured amount. You looked at other banks globally as being safer. So give us a sense of how risky you think the US banking sector is at the moment, because I believe you said that the top banks in the US are actually 60th in terms of safety on the global stage. Break that down for us.
Yeah, so they put an index together of the safest banks in the world. It used to be the 50 safest banks, and really no US bank would show up. Now it's 100 safest banks, and you're starting to see a couple of them. But you compare JP Morgan Chase, the stock has done pretty well in the last year, but you compare that to the big three banks in Singapore, it's a head and shoulders difference. Conservative, if you go to Hong Kong, for example, whether you like Hong Kong or not, I mean, for years it's been, we don't really want more money if we don't know who you are, if you're not referred to us, if you don't really live here full time. We're conservative, like we don't want money. How many banks are falling over in Hong Kong? How many banks are falling over in Singapore? A lot of banks fail in the U.S. It's the most failed bank country in the world by far. That's of course because there are a lot more banks. But I mean, look at the second, third, and fourth biggest bank failures in the world in the U.S. History last year. If you hold large balances, you're basically at the whim of Congress stepping in. And again, I go back to the earlier point of who's going to bail out the rich fat cats anymore when the average person doesn't have $500 for a car repair. And that's been the case for a long time, but I think it's getting worse now. Who's going to want to, let Congress go in and say, yeah, you know what, let's put some money and override the FDIC if they can't find someone to take over this bank. And what if it heats up? I mean, things were not as bad as they were expected to be by many people last year, and you still had these bank failures. So you're basically at the mercy of Congress stepping in. Now, if you're in the UAE during the Great Recession, you were at the mercy of the government stepping in, but they said, listen, we're going to insure every dollar, every dirham, everything, no matter what happens in our banks, because we have stricter standards for what it takes to be a bank. You've got to be publicly traded. There's all sorts of things. So I just think that other countries, I'm not a huge fan of UAE banks. The service is that great. The interface isn't that great, but like Singapore, for example, far superior in terms of, in my opinion, safety for large depositors. The problem is if you're an American, maybe they'll open an account for you, but it's increasingly tough because they don't need Americans.
You've highlighted Singapore as having the safest banks. What's the criteria for safety?
Well, the criteria is some of the banks are more conservative. I mean, the DBS Bank, I believe, was lending money to the central bank. I mean, they're just better run banks. They keep, stronger balance sheets. And, the US, I think it's just much more aggressive. Listen, maybe that contributes to some positive things if you're a shareholder, but if you're a depositor, listen, look at the index, right? I mean, people say, I'm going to keep my money in the safest place. Well, number 60 is not number 1.
So Development Bank of Singapore, DBS, one of the safest banks in your estimation. Now, I get the concern that if you have more than the FDIC is insuring, you want to spread around that money. For people that are able to diversify, where they keep some of their deposits spread around a number of banks globally, how much of that is actually legal, though? What are the implications of that? And I get that it differs depending on where you're from in the world and the jurisdictions there. But for the purpose of our audience, we'll keep it to Americans and some Canadians. So what is the strategy then of the Nomad Capitalist when it comes to diversified banking?
The strategy is your average accountant who does domestic work is not going to understand what you're doing. They're probably going to talk you out of it, and they're not going to understand which forms to file. And I've seen people who come to me who they had accountants, they were living overseas, for example, they were told they had to file forms. There are one or two relatively simple forms. If you have a trust structure, maybe there's an extra form. If you've got a foreign corporation, there's an extra form or two. But there's not that many forms. They're not that difficult to fill out. If you have an international focused, tax professional, they'll handle it for you. In fact, when I did my taxes as an expat, when I was an American, those forms were just part of the deal. Basically, it wasn't an extra cost. And so I don't think that should be an impediment if you're doing the other stuff. If you're doing enough to be able to justify having some kind of international accountant, it didn't cost me much more to have that, but you don't want to go down to your domestic preparer down the street. There's a couple of forms to file. You report the high balance. You report, movements between the accounts. And there's a few things to be aware of that some countries, some banks might have 3 accounts in one bank, and you want to be aware of all those different account numbers. But yeah, I at one point had something like 40 banks. I just went through recently and closed about 8 of them because they were too duplicative. And I realized they weren't serving me. But I've tested out a lot of banks. I like having diversification. I like having, assets in different places. And if it's in the country of Georgia, you can open an account with like $1. I'm going to keep a smaller amount there. Maybe I'll take advantage on the short-term basis of the very, very high interest rates there. And I'll keep much larger amounts in Singapore. I think European banks are probably pretty difficult to deal with. In many cases, there are some exceptions, but I think people should be looking at emerging markets or hubs like Singapore.
I've got sirens blaring in the background, Andrew, as though they're signaling that they think that the U.S. banking sector could be in a major sense of distress, as though they're figuratively
I'm afraid for
echoing.
your safety, Michelle.
As though they're figuratively echoing your sentiments there. Look, speaking of banks, Andrew, one of the speakers at this year's event in Kuala Lumpur is Nigel Farage. And he'll be talking about how to avoid bank accounts being cancelled with cancel culture and the future of the West. Now, Nigel Farage, of course, former British politician and broadcaster, very well known for his strong advocacy of the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, or Brexit, as he will. He was the leader of the UK Independence Party and later the Brexit Party. And there was a lot of controversy when Nigel Farage's bank account was closed, when he was essentially debanked from a prestigious private bank owned by the NatWest Group. And he was essentially taken out of the system, which is a big concern. And you could argue that was because of his political position. Explain how much of this is a growing issue, that cancel culture, political opinions, people not agreeing with your sentiments or ideologies gets you canceled out of the system, and what we can do about it.
Well, Nigel spoke at our event in 2022 in Mexico. And what he told me when I met him recently was, he said, I came to this thinking this is a good plan B. He said, I'm increasingly think it's a plan A. And what's funny is not long before he spoke at that event, we ran into him in Montenegro, where I have a summer home, and he's looking for opportunities. And I told him when this happened, I said, I understand, politically exposed person, former politically exposed person, that's an issue. But for the average person, if you have an opinion they don't like in the UK, like you're for Brexit and the banks don't like that, do you think they care in Montenegro? They probably have the opposite opinion. They're probably happy with you. They probably love you, right? It's a different opinion. So that's what I tell people. There's different opinions everywhere. And I think that, people think, oh, that sounds odd. Different countries see things differently. You can have America first in the US. Montenegro wants to have a Montenegro first. And that means if they have different views, they're going to promote those. Now, they're not extremely different. It's not Iran. But I told him he should be looking at places like that. What he told me was there are a lot of people in the UK that have had this problem that don't have a voice. And it is an issue. I've had accounts in the US closed. I don't think because of who I am. I think it's because of where I travel. I think it's because of US banks. When you use their credit card in Colombia, they freak out and they have this stereotype. I remember at one point, JP Morgan Chase cards, my parents would come to Malaysia. You can't use your card in Malaysia. I'm not sure if that's still the case, but they said it's a fraud country. I've never heard of that in my life. No other card, I have dozens of them, does not work in Malaysia. So there's the insular thinking of the United States banks and how they don't want people to travel. They don't like expats in many cases. But I think a lot of people are having that happen. Nigel says that in the UK, they're looking at legislation to fix that. But, if you're going to live in a free market world, I guess banks can work with who they want. If you're on the wrong side, that's why I want to be diversified. Because whether it's Montenegro or you fill in the blank, any number of other countries, especially smaller countries that aren't big banking hubs, they're not really going to care what you're doing. They want to know that your money's clean. And that you're clean, and they don't care about your perspective because those aren't their problems.